Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The Final Pages. The rain lashed against the window pane of a modest, yet refined townhouse in Bloomsbury, its steady patter mingling with the distant chimes of a clock striking midnight. Inside, a dimly lit study bore the unmistakable marks of both inspiration and disorder. A half-filled glass of brandy, ink-stained pages scattered across a walnut desk, and an overturned chair, lying just inches from the lifeless body of a man. Nigel Colton, one of England's most celebrated mystery novelists, lay motionless on the Turkish rug, his face contorted in an expression of shock and pain. His fingers curled as if in his final act he had reached for something, perhaps for help, or perhaps to leave a clue. The inkwell on his desk had been knocked over, and the black stain had crept across the final page of his latest manuscript, obscuring the very last words he had written. It was a scene worthy of Colton's own novels, only this time, the mystery was all too real. The discovery was made by his housekeeper, Mrs. Cattermole, a woman of stout build and nervous disposition. She had arrived early that morning, as she always did, to prepare her employer's tea, only to find the study door ajar and a silence far too ominous for the usually fastidious writer. Upon stepping inside, her scream echoed through the empty house, bringing the attention of a passing constable, who wasted no time in summoning the authorities. By midday, Scotland Yard had descended upon the scene, and with them, a man whose mere presence struck both admiration and trepidation into those who encountered him. Chief Inspector James McLaren. He was a man of straightforward methods and little patience for what he deemed theatrics. And yet, as he surveyed the room and the peculiarities of the crime scene, he could not deny that this case was unlike the usual affairs of burglary gone wrong or jealous lovers turned violent. There was something deliberate here, something calculated. It was precisely the sort of case that required a mind as sharp as the blade that had ended Nigel Colton's life. And so, with a reluctant sigh, McLaren instructed his sergeant to send word to Whitehaven Mansions. Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective, had always held a particular fascination with the world of literature. Though he prided himself on his logic and method, he often remarked that the mind of a great writer could sometimes rival that of a great detective. It was, therefore, with interest that he read the brief note delivered to his residence, requesting his presence at Bloomsbury Square. "Mon ami, this is most intriguing," he said, setting the note aside with a delicate touch. Across from him, Captain Hastings, his loyal companion and occasional chronicler of his cases, frowned as he stirred his tea. "You find a murder intriguing, Poirot?" "Naturellement, Hastings. But consider, this is not merely a murder. It is a mystery that has been crafted as if from the pages of a novel. The victim is a celebrated writer of detective fiction, and yet he did not foresee his own demise. There is a certain irony, no?" Hastings sighed. "I suppose when you put it like that." Poirot dabbed his mouth with a napkin and rose to retrieve his hat and coat. "Come, mon ami, we must not keep Inspector McLaren waiting. A writer has left us his final manuscript, and I suspect it contains more than just fiction." The townhouse at Bloomsbury Square stood in somber silence as Poirot and Hastings arrived. A uniformed constable stepped aside as they entered, leading them through the corridor to the study. Poirot's keen eyes took in everything: the well-kept furniture, the absence of struggle, the faint scent of ink and old paper lingering in the air. McLaren was already inside, standing near the body with arms crossed, his expression betraying his irritation at having to involve the detective. "Poirot," he greeted curtly. "Ah, Chief Inspector," Poirot replied, his mustache twitching in amusement. It seems you have summoned me to a case most singular, McLaren grunted. It's singular, all right. Nigel Colton, stabbed in his own study. No sign of forced entry, nothing stolen, and, get this, he was in the middle of writing his, latest novel when he was killed. Poirot moved closer, his gaze sweeping over the desk and the ink-stained manuscript. Most curious. And these are his final words? He gestured at the pages. Yes, but the ink spilled over the last line. McLaren muttered. We can't read what he wrote. Could have been important. Could have been nothing. Poirot picked up the topmost sheet with careful precision, studying the looping script. A writer's final words are seldom unimportant, Chief Inspector. They are his legacy. He turned to Hastings. Mon ami, do you recall the affair of the missing play manuscript in Paris? The author had hidden a clue in... Hastings groaned. Poirot, I beg you, no more digressions. McLaren cleared his throat. If you're quite finished with your storytelling, I'd appreciate your thoughts on this mess. Poirot gave a small bow. Mais oui, and tell me, who had reason to wish Monsieur Colton dead? McLaren sighed. That's the problem. The man was wealthy, successful, and had no known enemies, at least, none that we can see. Poirot smiled knowingly. Ah, but Chief Inspector, the enemies of a writer are not always known to the world. Sometimes they are hidden within the pages of their own work. With that, he turned his full attention to the ink-stained manuscript, his mind already whirring with possibilities. Somewhere in these pages, the answer lay waiting for the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot to uncover it. Chapter 2. A Writer's Secrets. Hercule Poirot stood in the center of Nigel Colton's study, his sharp eyes absorbing every detail, with meticulous precision. The body had already been removed, but the presence of death lingered in the air. The ink-stained manuscript remained untouched on the desk, an unfinished puzzle left behind by the murdered writer. Inspector McLaren, standing with his arms crossed, exhaled impatiently. Well, Poirot, you asked to see the crime scene before anything was disturbed. What do you make of it? Poirot adjusted his cuffs before stepping forward. Mon cher, every crime scene is a stage, and the victim, he is both the actor and the playwright. This room tells a story, if one has the eyes to read it. He bent slightly, inspecting the desk with an almost reverential air. The inkwell is overturned. Ah, but not in a haphazard manner. Look, Hastings, the ink spreads in a peculiar arc. And the pages, they are not merely scattered. They were disturbed with purpose. Hastings, who had been observing quietly, frowned. You mean someone deliberately knocked the ink over? To hide what Colton was writing? Poirot tapped his temple. Très bien, Hastings. A man in the throes of death rarely concerns himself with his papers. But if he were trying to leave, a message. Ah, then, that is another matter entirely. McLaren snorted. We've already sent the manuscript to the lab to see if they can recover the writing underneath. Poirot smiled indulgently. That is good, but I suspect the true message is not so easily erased. He turned his attention to the chair, still lying on its side. Curious. If a struggle had occurred, more would be disturbed, and yet, the chair alone is overturned. He crouched, inspecting the rug. No scuff marks, no signs of a violent fight. His fingers grazed a faint indentation in the fibers. Ah, Hastings, what do you observe? Hastings peered over, his shoulder. It looks like a mark left by a shoe, perhaps. Poirot nodded approvingly. Exactement. But a very particular kind of shoe. See the shape. This is no ordinary men's boot. This is the delicate print of a slipper. Perhaps belonging to a woman. McLaren sighed. So? You think a woman was here last night? Could have been his housekeeper, Mrs. Catamole. Poirot lifted a finger. Non, mon ami. She discovered the body in the morning. And unless she is an exceptional actress, Her distress was genuine. No, I believe another guest was here, one who did not wish to be seen. Hastings scratched his head. But wouldn't Colton have mentioned if he was expecting a visitor? McLaren flipped open his notebook. We checked his diary. No scheduled meetings, no planned appointments. If someone came here, it wasn't an official visit. Poirot turned back to the desk, brushing his fingertips lightly over the ink-stained manuscript. Monsieur Colton was a man of words. If he could not speak his truth, he would write it. This ink, it obscures his last message, but perhaps... He stopped, his gaze narrowing at something beneath the blot of ink. Ah, Inspector, do you have a magnifying glass? McLaren grunted, fishing one from his coat and handing it over. Poirot leaned closer, examining the paper carefully. The thick smear of ink had spread unevenly, but at the very edge of the page, faint indentations remained visible where the pen had pressed harder. He straightened, a glint of triumph in his eyes. Aha! Hastings, mon ami, tell me, what is the most important element of a mystery novel? Hastings blinked. Well, the crime, of course. Poirot waved a hand. Pah! No, no. The crime is but the surface. It is the truth beneath the crime that matters. And our dear Monsieur Colton, he tried to tell us this truth before he was silenced. McLaren leaned forward. You mean you can read what's under the ink? Poirot smiled knowingly. Not yet, but I see enough. The pressure of his hand has left an imprint, just the beginnings of a word, but it is enough to intrigue me. McLaren huffed. And? What does it say? Poirot tapped the paper lightly. The first letter is an L. There was a moment of silence as the implication settled over them. Hastings was the first to speak. An L? That could mean anything. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed, but it is a beginning. And in the absence of physical evidence, we must turn to those who knew the victim best. McLaren grumbled but nodded. Right. We've identified several people close to Colton, his publisher, his fiancée, and a few fellow writers. We're bringing them in for questioning. Poirot clapped his hands. Très bien. Then let us begin. The ink may obscure one truth, but people, mon cher, they have a way of revealing far more than they intend. And with that, the great detective turned, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. Chapter 3. The Circle of Suspects. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings sat comfortably in Inspector McLaren's office at Scotland Yard, awaiting the arrival of their first interviewee. A steady rain pattered against the windows, casting streaks of shadow across the wooden desk. Poirot sat with his hands neatly folded, his sharp eyes watching the door expectantly, while Hastings shifted in his seat, ever eager for the investigation. To gain momentum, McLaren, standing by the file cabinet, checked his watch and sighed. Howard Felton should be here any moment. He was Nigel Colton's publisher, handled all of his works for the last 15 years. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. The relationship between an author and his publisher, it is one of necessity, but also of tension, is it not? The success of one depends upon the other, McLaren smirked. I doubt Felton killed his own star writer. Colton made him a lot of money. At that moment, the door opened, and a man in his mid-50s entered. He was tall and lean, with thinning blonde hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. His navy blue suit was slightly rumpled, and his expression was a mixture of irritation and fatigue. He removed his rain-speckled hat and gave a quick glance around the room before focusing on Poirot and Hastings. Howard Felton, he introduced himself, his voice clipped. I understand you needed to speak with me regarding Nigel Colton's death. Terrible business. Simply terrible. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed, Monsieur Felton. Please, sit. Felton did so, crossing his legs and adjusting his cuffs with the practiced ease of a man used to professional dealings. I assume you have questions. Poirot's gaze was steady. Mais oui. You were, I believe, the last person to see Monsieur Colton alive? Felton exhaled sharply. Yes, I visited him at his home yesterday evening, around 8 o'clock. We had a business discussion. McLaren's pen scratched against paper. What kind of business? Felton hesitated a fraction, too long before replying. A disagreement over his latest manuscript. Nigel was a brilliant writer but also stubborn. He was working on a new novel, a masterpiece he called it, but he refused to let me or anyone else see it before it was finished. He had always been secretive, but this time it was different. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Different? In what way, monsieur? Felton shifted uncomfortably. He was paranoid. He spoke of people trying to steal his work, of watchful eyes, as he put it. It was rather unsettling, to be honest. I assumed it was just artistic anxiety. Many writers suffer from it. But now, given what has happened... Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings before asking, "And did Monsieur Colton say anything specific? Any names he feared?" Felton shook his head. "No, nothing definite. Just vague mutterings about certain people who wouldn't want the truth to come." "Out!" He ran a hand through his hair. "I thought he meant literary rivals. Colton had plenty of those." McLaren frowned. "And what time did you leave his house?" "A little after 9, Felton answered. Nigel was in an agitated mood, so... I didn't stay long. He walked me to the door himself. He was very much alive when I left." Poirot observed him keenly. "Did you notice anything unusual when you departed? Anyone watching the house? Anything out of place?" Felton considered for a moment, then shook his head. "No, nothing. The street was quiet, but..." He hesitated. "But?" Hastings prompted. Felton's fingers drummed against the armrest. "I did see someone approaching the house as I walked away. A woman, though I couldn't make out her features. She was wearing a dark coat and hat, moving quickly. She turned onto Colton's walkway just as I reached the corner." Poirot's expression remained neutral. "Did Colton mention expecting a visitor?" "No, he didn't," Felton said. "And if I had to guess, I'd say he wasn't expecting one. He looked preoccupied when I left, as if he intended to return to his work immediately." McLaren leaned forward. "You have no idea who this woman might be?" Felton hesitated. "Well, there was Eleanor Wade, his secretary. She would often visit him at home to collect manuscripts or discuss edits. But I can't say for certain if it was her." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Monsieur Felton, what were your personal feelings towards Nigel Colton?" Felton's mouth pressed into a thin line. He was brilliant, but infuriating. A genius, but impossible to work with at times. He second-guessed every decision, refused to compromise, and could be incredibly secretive. But despite all that, I respected him immensely. His books sold well, and he had a loyal readership. His death is a great loss." Poirot's gaze lingered on Felton for a moment before he nodded. "Merci, Monsieur Felton. That will be all for now." Felton stood and retrieved his hat. "If you need anything further, you know where to find me." With that, he exited, leaving behind a faint trace of expensive cologne and an air of controlled tension. Hastings turned to Poirot. "Well, what do you think?" Poirot tapped his lips thoughtfully. "Monsieur Felton is a man of business first and foremost. He is shaken, yes, but there is something he did not say." McLaren scoffed. "You suspect him?" Poirot shrugged. "I suspect everyone, Chief Inspector. That is the way of a thorough investigator. But for now, let us turn our attention to this mysterious woman. If she truly visited Colton after Felton left, she may well have been the last to see him alive." McLaren checked his notes. "Eleanor. Wade is due to arrive in an hour," Poirot smiled. "Excellent. Let us see what secrets she may hold." As the rain continued to fall outside, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to take shape in Poirot's mind. One thing was certain. Nigel Colton had feared something or someone, and whatever secret his unfinished manuscript contained, it had been worth killing for. Chapter 4. Clues in the Margins. The rain had eased into a light drizzle by the time Eleanor Wade arrived at Scotland Yard. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with auburn hair neatly pulled into a low, chignon and sharp, intelligent eyes that darted about the room with keen awareness. Dressed in a dark green coat and modestly heeled shoes, she carried herself with a quiet confidence. She removed her gloves slowly, a gesture of calm composure, but Poirot did not miss the slight tremor in her fingers. "Miss Wade," Inspector McLaren said, motioning for her to sit. "Thank you for coming in." She nodded politely before turning, her gaze toward Poirot. "I assume you are Monsieur Poirot? Nigel often spoke of you." Poirot's brows lifted. "Ah? And what did he say, mademoiselle?" A small, fleeting smile played at her lips. "That you were insufferably meticulous, and that if he were ever in real trouble, you were the only detective he would trust." Poirot inclined his head, pleased. "A man of excellent judgment, your employer." Her expression darkened slightly. "He was more than just my employer. He was my friend." "Then, mademoiselle, perhaps you can help us understand what might have led to his death," Poirot said gently. She took a slow breath before responding. "I don't know. I truly don't. Nigel was always secretive, but these past few weeks he had been different, anxious, suspicious. He spoke of people watching him, of needing to be careful with his work. I thought he was just being dramatic. He could be that way sometimes." Poirot studied her carefully. "Mademoiselle, were you at Nigel Colton's house last night?" She stiffened, just barely, before nodding. "Yes, I was." McLaren's eyes flicked up from his notes. "Howard Felton said he saw a woman approaching the house after he left." "That was me," Eleanor admitted. "I arrived around 9:30. Poirot leaned forward. "And why did you visit so late?" "I had been trying to call him all day," she explained. "He wasn't answering, which wasn't unusual, but I needed to see him." "He had promised to give me a portion of his manuscript to type up. He always wrote longhand first, and then I would transcribe it. But this time, he had refused. He said no one was to see it until he was finished. I thought if I went in person, he might relent." McLaren frowned. "And did he?" She shook her head. "He barely let me inside. He seemed nervous, distracted. He told me he wasn't ready yet, that he had to get it all down before anyone read it. I was about to leave. When he stopped me," Poirot's gaze sharpened. "What did he say?" Eleanor hesitated, as if weighing her words. "He said, 'If anything happens to me, you must find it. It's all in there. The truth.'" Hastings exhaled sharply. Good heavens. He knew something was going to happen to him. "I don't know," she admitted, "but he was afraid. He asked me if I trusted Howard Felton. I said I did. He just shook his head and muttered, 'Trust no one.'" Poirot steepled his fingers. "And what did you do next?" "I left," she said. "I didn't push him. I thought he was just being his usual eccentric self. Now, I wish I had stayed." McLaren scribbled something in his notebook. "What time did you leave?" "Around 10, she said. "He walked me to the door." Poirot frowned slightly. "And you saw nothing unusual? No one else arriving?" She shook her head. "No one." Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. "Mademoiselle, this manuscript of Monsieur Colton, do you have any idea what it was about?" She hesitated again. "I think it was something dangerous." McLaren sat up. "Dangerous in what way?" Eleanor folded her arms, looking down. "I'm not sure, but he had been obsessed with a new idea for months. He wouldn't even let me read his notes. That wasn't like him. Nigel always trusted me." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And yet, in the end, he told you to find it, which suggests he did trust you." She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable. "Yes, And now I must. Poirot smiled slightly. Leave that to me, mademoiselle. The truth, it is most determined. It always finds its way out. Eleanor nodded, but Poirot could see the worry in her eyes. She was hiding something. Not out of guilt, perhaps, but out of fear. After she left, Hastings turned to Poirot. Well, that was revealing. Indeed, mon ami. And troubling. McLaren sighed. Colton knew something, and whatever it was, it got him killed. We need to find that manuscript. Poirot rose gracefully to his feet. Yes, Chief Inspector, and I suspect we must do so quickly, because if we are not the first to find it, then the murderer will be. Chapter 5. The Deceptive Alibi, the Morning. Air was crisp when Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings arrived at Nigel Colton's townhouse. The previous evening's rain had left the streets damp, the scent of wet stone lingering in the air. Scotland Yard had finished their preliminary search, but Poirot had insisted on examining the scene personally. McLaren, though skeptical of Poirot's methods, had agreed to grant them access. A uniformed officer stationed at the door nodded as they entered. The house was eerily quiet, as if aware of its owner's absence. Poirot removed his gloves carefully, glancing around with meticulous interest. The sitting room was modestly furnished, its decor reflecting a man of intellect rather than extravagance. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes ranging from classic literature to modern crime fiction. A writing desk stood near the window, covered in loose sheets of paper, pens, and an overturned inkwell. Poirot approached the desk, his eyes sweeping over the clutter. This is where he worked, Hastings. He ran a finger along the edge of the table, pausing at a torn scrap of paper near the inkwell. Carefully, he lifted it. The ink had bled slightly due to the damp air, but the words were still legible. It is not fiction. They will know. They will... Poirot read aloud before stopping abruptly. The sentence was unfinished, ending in a jagged tear. He turned it over, examining the edges. Mon Dieu, it was ripped hurriedly, but by whom? Hastings leaned in. You think Colton was writing this when he was attacked? Poirot shook his head. Non, mon ami. If he had been in the middle of writing, there would be more ink smudging. His pen is still full, untouched. He gestured toward the pen resting in its holder. No, this was torn after it was written. And look here. He pointed to the inkwell, which had toppled sideways, staining the blotter. If he had been writing, would the inkwell not be upright? Hastings frowned. You mean someone else knocked it over? Exactament. And see how the ink has dried unevenly. It suggests movement, disturbance before it could settle completely. Poirot replaced the torn paper carefully. This was not a simple burglary. The killer was searching for something. McLaren entered. From the hallway, arms folded. Nothing obvious is missing. His wallet was still in his coat, and no valuables have been taken. The manuscript, Poirot murmured. That is what they were after. McLaren exhaled. We checked everywhere. No sign of it. Poirot's sharp eyes moved about the room. And yet, Monsieur Colton believed it was here. He moved toward the fireplace, where an empty brandy glass rested on a side table. He picked it up delicately. Ah, only one glass, meaning he was alone, or rather, intended to be alone. Hastings looked puzzled. Do you think he expected his murderer? Non, mon ami, but he expected someone, perhaps someone he did not entirely trust. Poirot turned suddenly. We must search the study again, properly. McLaren sighed but nodded. The three men entered the study, a small, dimly lit room with a heavy wooden desk and more bookshelves. The air smelled faintly of ink and old paper. Poirot walked the perimeter, running his fingers along the spines of the books, then pausing at a particular volume, a thick, unmarked book that appeared slightly newer than the others. He pulled it free, and a small click echoed through the room. McLaren tensed. What was that? Poirot smiled. A man who writes mysteries, mon cher, is likely to live within one. He pressed against the shelf, and with a soft creak, a hidden compartment slid open behind the bookcase. Inside, stacked neatly, were several sheets of manuscript paper. Hastings whistled. By Jove, you found it! Poirot retrieved the pages carefully, laying them on the desk. The handwriting was unmistakably Colton's. He scanned the first few lines, his expression unreadable. McLaren leaned over his shoulder. What does it say? Poirot's voice was quiet as he read aloud. The truth must be told, even if it costs me everything. It is not fiction. It is a confession. A heavy silence filled the room. Hastings swallowed. A confession? Poirot nodded. This is no ordinary manuscript, mes amis. This is why he was killed. Because he was about to expose something, or someone. McLaren straightened. Then we need to read the rest. If he named names, Poirot lifted a hand. Patience, Chief Inspector. We must be methodical. He continued reading, flipping through the pages. Suddenly, he stopped. His fingers tightened slightly on the paper. What is it? Hastings asked. Poirot's expression was unusually grave. It appears the final pages are missing. McLaren cursed under his breath. Damn it! Could the killer have taken them? Perhaps, Poirot murmured. Or perhaps someone else got to them first. The implications hung in the air. Someone else knew what was in those missing pages. Someone who either wished to conceal the truth or use it. Hastings cleared his throat. What do we do now? Poirot tapped the remaining pages thoughtfully. We find out who wanted Nigel Colton. Silenced. And more importantly, we find out what they were so desperate to hide. Chapter 6. Poirot's hidden clue. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Whitehaven Manor, casting long shadows across the drawing room where Hercule Poirot sat, his hands steepled before him in deep thought. Captain Hastings observed his friend with some impatience, pacing the room while Poirot remained frustratingly still. The case had reached a turning point, and yet Poirot had said nothing of his conclusions. Poirot, Hastings finally burst out, you have been sitting there for nearly an hour without a word. Surely you must see something that we do not. What are we missing? Poirot smiled faintly and gestured for Hastings to sit. Mon ami, it is not about what we are missing. It is about what we have overlooked. There is a clue, a single detail that everyone has seen. And yet, it remains invisible. Hastings frowned. And have you found it? Poirot gave a small nod. Indeed. But let us examine what we know so far, no? He rose and paced the room, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. We have before us the murder of Jonathan Fanshawe, a successful author, found dead in his study with his unfinished manuscript scattered upon his desk. The cause of death, a fatal blow to the head. No signs of forced entry, and the room locked from within. Hastings nodded. And our suspects, each with a motive. Ah, precisely. Lady Margaret Fanshawe, the devoted yet secretive wife who stood to inherit a substantial fortune. Henry Lawson, the publisher, desperate to secure Fanshawe's final manuscript. Miss Evelyn Harper, the assistant, who knew the author's work better than anyone. And Mr. Alfred Groves, the envious rival writer who resented Fanshawe's success. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A formidable collection of individuals, n'est-ce pas? But only one of them is guilty, and the answer has been in front of us all along. Hastings leaned forward, anticipation building. And what is this answer? Poirot smiled cryptically. First, we must revisit the manuscript. Retrieving the scattered pages from Fanshawe's study, Poirot examined them once more. He turned to Evelyn Harper, who had just entered the room. Mademoiselle, you were the last to work on this manuscript, were you not? Evelyn hesitated before nodding. Yes, I was helping Mr. Fanshawe edit the final chapters. And you recall every word, every sentence, every note? Poirot pressed. She nodded again. Of course. Poirot held up a page. Then tell me, what is missing from this manuscript? Evelyn frowned, scanning the page. I don't understand. Poirot tapped the paper. The final paragraph. It ends mid-sentence. And yet, the next page is completely blank. Now, mon ami Hastings, tell me, if one were to kill a man in the middle of his writing, would he not leave behind an unfinished sentence? Hastings considered this. Yes, I suppose so. Alors. But what if he did not? Silence fell upon the room as realization dawned. Poirot turned sharply to Evelyn Harper. Mademoiselle, you said you were the last person to see Fanshawe alive. Tell me, what did he write last? Evelyn swallowed hard. He was writing about his main character's demise. He mentioned something about betrayal, about a trusted friend turning against him. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And yet, there is no such passage here. A long silence followed. Then, Evelyn's expression shifted, just slightly. Poirot caught the flicker of panic, the almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers around her skirt. You see, Poirot continued, his voice softer now, this is where the truth hides. The real final pages of this manuscript are missing. They were taken. Why? Because they contained something the murderer could not allow to be seen. Evelyn's breath came faster. I don't understand what you're implying. Poirot walked toward the fireplace, where a faint trace of ash still clung to the hearth. He picked up a few small charred fragments and turned them over in his fingers. Paper burns quickly, mademoiselle, but sometimes not all of it is lost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. I found this in the grate, he said, handing it to Hastings. A fragment of Fanshawe's last words. Hastings squinted at the smudged ink. It's barely readable. Something about the one I trust most. Poirot nodded. Precisely. And tell me, Mademoiselle Harper, who was the one person Fanshawe trusted most? Evelyn's hands trembled now. I was just his assistant. He trusted many people. No. Poirot cut her off gently. He trusted you. You handled his notes. You knew every secret of his work. You were the keeper of his words. He paused, letting his words settle. And he suspected you. A deep, sharp silence filled the air. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the door, but Poirot shook his head. Do not run, mademoiselle. It is over. Hastings exhaled, his heart pounding. You mean she killed him? Poirot nodded gravely. Oui. Fanshawe was about to expose something, perhaps a betrayal, a theft, or a deception she committed. She struck him before he could write the truth, then took the real final pages and burned them. Evelyn's face turned pale. You can't prove that. Poirot smiled. Ah, but I can. You see, the ink on Fanshawe's fingers, it matches only one pen in this house. The one you took from his desk, and the missing pages. They are not entirely gone. A single corner remained unburnt, and on it, your name. Evelyn staggered. Back, her breath coming in short gasps. No, it's not possible. Poirot turned to the others. Mes amis, the case is nearly complete. We have our murderer. But tomorrow, I shall gather everyone, and we shall reveal the full truth. With that, he turned away, leaving Evelyn frozen in place as the weight of her crime closed in around her. Chapter 7. The Final Gathering. The following evening, the grand drawing room of Whitehaven Manor was filled with tension as Hercule Poirot took his place before an audience of anxious faces. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, the crackling fire providing the only warmth against the chill that had settled in both the room and its occupants. Captain Hastings stood beside Poirot, his expression set with anticipation, while Inspector Morton took his place near the door, ensuring that no one could leave before the great detective had spoken. Seated in various states of discomfort were the suspects: Lady Margaret Fanshawe, her fingers clutching a lace handkerchief; Henry Lawson, shifting in his chair with visible unease; Alfred Groves, his lips pressed into a thin line; and Evelyn Harper, whose face remained carefully composed. Despite the storm brewing beneath the surface, Poirot let the silence stretch before speaking. "Mes amis, we have reached the moment of truth. The tragic death of Jonathan Fanshawe was not an accident, nor was it a crime of passion. It was a carefully calculated act, committed by someone who sought to protect a terrible secret." Lady Margaret gave a sharp intake of breath. Henry Lawson wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Alfred Groves scoffed but said nothing. Evelyn Harper merely stared at Poirot, her lips pursed. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, defiance or fear, it was hard to tell. Poirot clasped his hands together. "Before I reveal the identity of the murderer, let us consider the facts." He began pacing slowly. "First, we have the method of the crime. A fatal blow to the head, delivered with an object heavy enough to kill instantly. The scene was staged to appear as though Mr. Fanshawe had been alone, yet there was no forced entry. This means that our murderer was someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to let into his study." His sharp gaze swept over the room. "Second, we have the missing pages of the manuscript, torn from the typewriter and burned in the fireplace. Why would someone destroy the final words of a dying man? Because, mes amis, those words revealed a dangerous truth." A murmur passed through the room. Hastings leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Poirot continued. "We must also recall the ink stains found on Mr. Fanshawe's fingers. Ink that did not match the pen found on his desk, but rather another pen, one that had been taken and discarded after the deed was done. And then we have the final clue, the one piece of evidence that the murderer could not erase." He turned toward Evelyn Harper. "Mademoiselle Harper, do you recall what you told me yesterday? That Mr. Fanshawe was working on a story about betrayal?" Evelyn's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Poirot did not break his gaze. "He was writing about a trusted friend, a confidant who had deceived him. But what if it was more than just fiction? What if Mr. Fanshawe had begun to suspect that someone close to him was guilty of treachery, not in his stories, but in real life?" A hush fell over the room. Poirot's voice grew softer, more precise. "Mademoiselle, you were more than an assistant to Mr. Fanshawe. You were his first reader, his most trusted critic. And yet, in the last weeks of his life, you began to realize that he suspected something about you, did you not?" Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. "This is ridiculous. I had no reason to harm Mr. Fanshawe. I was loyal to him." "Non, mademoiselle," Poirot said gravely. "You were not. You had been stealing his work." Gasps erupted from the room. Poirot pressed on. "Yes, you were clever. Over the years you had taken ideas, passages, even entire outlines, submitting them under a different name to publishers who thought they had discovered a fresh new talent. But Jonathan Fanshawe was no fool. He began to notice, to recognize his own words in places they should not have been. And that is why, on the night of his murder, he was writing, not a story, but a confession. He had discovered the truth, and he intended to expose you." Evelyn's face had turned deathly pale. Poirot withdrew a small, crumpled slip of paper from his pocket. "Here is what remains of the page you tried to destroy. It is only a fragment, but the words are unmistakable. The one I trust most has been my greatest betrayer." A choked sound escaped Evelyn's throat. Poirot took a step forward. "You confronted him, did you not? Perhaps he accused you outright. Perhaps you tried to deny it at first. But you knew, once he told his publisher, your secret life would be ruined. So, in desperation, you seized the nearest object, struck him, Down, and in your panic, you tore out the pages of his confession and burned them. The room held its breath. Evelyn shook her head wildly. No, this isn't true. It is the only truth, Poirot said firmly, and you know it. For a moment, it seemed as though she might continue to deny it. Then, her shoulders sagged. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she whispered, I didn't mean to. He wasn't supposed to. Inspector Morton stepped forward. Miss Harper, I think it's time you came with me. Evelyn looked around the room as if searching for someone to plead to, but found only condemning stares. She exhaled shakily, then nodded. I just wanted to be recognized. I wanted to be someone. Poirot gave a small, sad smile. Ah, mademoiselle, but you could have been. You had talent, but instead of patience, you chose deceit. And now, you must face the consequences. As Inspector Morton led Evelyn away, the room remained silent. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. And so, mes amis, the case is closed. The mystery of the unfinished manuscript is complete. Hastings let out a breath. Poirot, you never cease to amaze me. I was convinced it could have been any one of them. Poirot smiled knowingly. Ah, mon ami, it is never about who could have done it, but who must have done it. And in the end, the truth is always written, even when one tries to erase it. With that, he turned on his heel, his work complete, as the echoes of justice settled over Whitehaven Manor. Chapter 8. The Final Truth. The drawing room of Whitehaven Manor had emptied considerably since Evelyn Harper's arrest. The grand chandelier cast an eerie glow over the polished mahogany furniture, the very air seeming to hum with the echoes of Poirot's deductions. Inspector Morton had taken the disgraced assistant away, leaving behind a collection of stunned faces. Lady Margaret Fanshawe, still clutching her handkerchief, Henry Lawson, pale and thoughtful, and Alfred Groves, whose sharp eyes flickered between them. Captain Hastings, seated near the fireplace, exhaled deeply. Well, Poirot, I suppose that settles it. Miss Harper was the murderer. Case closed, as they say. Poirot, standing by the window, his hands neatly clasped behind his back, made a small noise of disagreement. Non, mon ami, the case is not yet closed. There is still one thing that troubles me. Hastings frowned. What do you mean? The confession was as good as given. Poirot turned, his gaze sharp. Yes, she confessed to striking. Jonathan Fanshawe, she admitted her crime, but I ask you, was it truly the crime of murder? A heavy silence fell. Lady Margaret, her voice hoarse, spoke hesitantly. Surely you are not suggesting that she was innocent? Poirot shook his head. No, milady. She was guilty of a terrible act, but I do not believe she intended to kill him. She struck in desperation. Yes, but something still does not sit right with me. There is a final piece of the puzzle missing. Henry Lawson cleared his throat. But surely, Poirot, the mystery is over. Miss Harper had the motive. She had access. She even destroyed the manuscript pages. What more is there to uncover? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, monsieur, but what if she did not destroy the manuscript? Gasps followed. Hastings shot to his feet. But, Poirot, we saw the burnt remains in the fireplace. Poirot nodded. Indeed, but mon ami, let us consider the nature of a writer. They do not write only once. They draft, they revise, they make copies. He stepped forward, his voice steady. Jonathan Fanshawe was not a careless man. If he was writing a confession of betrayal, do you not think he would have kept a copy hidden? Elsewhere? Lady Margaret let out a small cry. You mean it still exists? Poirot's eyes gleamed. That is exactly what I mean. Without another word, he strode toward the grand bookcase that lined the far wall. Carefully, he ran his fingers along the spines of the books, pausing only when he reached a leather-bound volume titled The Secrets of Ancient Manuscripts. With a precise tug, the book shifted, and with it, a small compartment creaked open in the back of the shelf. From within, Poirot extracted a stack of neatly typed pages. "The final words of Jonathan Fanshawe," he declared. A hush fell over the room. Hastings, eyes wide, watched as Poirot unfolded the top page and began reading aloud. "Have long suspected the betrayal, but it was only today that I found proof. A certain individual in my life, one whom I trusted, has been working against me. I can no longer keep silent. If anything happens to me, let it be known that the true hand behind my misfortune is—" Poirot stopped reading. The room was deathly. Still, Lady Margaret whispered, "Who? Who did he name?" Poirot's gaze was grave as he turned the page toward them. "Henry Lawson." The blood drained from Henry Lawson's face. Hastings took a step forward, stunned. "Lawson? But Evelyn Harper admitted to striking him. Surely this must be a mistake." Poirot shook his head. "No, Hastings. This is the final truth. Evelyn. Harper struck Jonathan Fanshawe, yes, but she did not kill him. When she fled, panicked, believing she had committed murder, he was still alive. Someone else entered that study afterward. Someone who saw an opportunity to silence him permanently." Lady Margaret gasped. "Henry!" Lawson stood frozen, his hands trembling. "This is madness. You can't possibly believe—" Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "I do not believe, monsieur. I know." He stepped closer, eyes locking onto Lawson's. "You were Jonathan Fanshawe's financial manager. You had access to his accounts, his wealth. But what he did not realize, until it was too late, was that you had been slowly siphoning his fortune. At first, small amounts, nothing noticeable. But over time, the losses added up. And when Mr. Fanshawe finally discovered the missing money, he confronted you, did he not?" Lawson's lips parted, but no words came. "You were desperate. If he exposed you, your career, your entire reputation would be in ruins. You had to silence him. And when you arrived that night, you found him still alive, barely conscious from Miss Harper's blow. And so you did what she could not. You finished the job." A choking sound escaped Lady Margaret. "Oh, dear God." Hastings took an unconscious step back. "Poirot, are you saying Lawson delivered the final blow?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. He struck the true fatal blow, ensuring Fanshawe could never reveal the truth. And then he staged the scene, making it appear as though no one else had entered after Evelyn Harper had fled." Lawson's breath came in short gasps. This is absurd. You have no proof." Poirot's smile was razor-sharp. "Ah, but I do, monsieur. The ink on Fanshawe's fingers, it did not match the ink in his study. That is because, in his final moments, he had attempted to write one last message. He had reached for the only pen within his grasp, the one you carried. He withdrew a small, dark fountain pen from his pocket. This was found in the waste bin in your room, Monsieur Lawson. It is stained with the very same ink that was found on Jonathan Fanshawe's fingers. The color drained entirely from Lawson's face. Lady Margaret whispered, "Henry, how could you?" Lawson's body swayed, as though the weight of the truth had finally crushed him. He sagged into a chair, his hands covering his face. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Inspector Morton will be most interested in this development." Hastings, still in shock, exhaled sharply. "So, Evelyn Harper. She was guilty of striking him, but she wasn't the true murderer. She believed she had killed him, but it was Lawson
who finished the job." Poirot nodded. "Exactly, mon ami. Miss Harper's crime was one of desperation. Lawson's? One of cold calculation." As the room sat in stunned silence, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Inspector Morton, having been summoned
earlier by a discreet note from Poirot, stepped into the room. One look at Henry Lawson's defeated posture told him everything he needed to know. "Henry Lawson," the inspector said grimly. I believe we have a few questions for you. Lawson said nothing as the weight of justice descended upon him. Poirot, ever composed, straightened his tie and looked at Hastings with a knowing smile. And so, mon ami, the case of the unfinished manuscript is finally complete. As Lawson was led away, the storm that had raged for so long in Whitehaven Manor finally began to settle. Chapter 9. Poirot's Final Test. The storm that had loomed over Whitehaven Manor for days had finally broken, and yet the tension inside, its grand halls, remained thick, as though the very walls held their breath. Henry Lawson had been taken away, his downfall sealed by the keen mind of Hercule Poirot. Evelyn Harper, once accused of murder, was now exonerated, but the air was not yet clear. As Poirot stood near the grand fireplace, hands clasped neatly before him, he surveyed the remaining figures in the room. Lady Margaret Fanshawe sat with a fragile poise, her hands trembling slightly as she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Alfred Groves, the publisher, had retreated to a shadowed corner, his expression unreadable. And then there was Captain Hastings, pacing near the bookshelves, his face still colored with the shock of all that had transpired. At last, Hastings broke the silence. "Well, Poirot, you have done it again. I can hardly believe it. Lawson, of all people, if you had told me yesterday that he was capable of murder, I would have laughed in your face." Poirot inclined his head. "Mon ami, murder is a crime that does not always reveal itself in the obvious places. It hides behind respectable smiles, beneath carefully chosen words. It is not always the one who shouts the loudest who is the most dangerous, but rather the one who keeps silent, waiting for the opportune moment." Lady Margaret let out a soft sigh. "To think, my husband suspected him all along. If only he had told me sooner." Poirot turned to her with gentle sympathy. "It is often the way of things, milady. When one learns of a betrayal, there is a great shame in admitting it. It is the human heart's weakness to trust too much, even when the mind begins to see the truth." Alfred Groves cleared his throat, stepping forward at last. "But what of the manuscript? The true one, I mean. We have Jonathan's hidden draft, yes, but was it truly finished? What were his final words?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, monsieur, that is the final question, is it not? The title of this case, the unfinished manuscript, it carries a meaning beyond the literal." Hastings frowned. "What do you mean, Poirot?" With careful precision, Poirot reached for the stack of pages he had retrieved from the hidden compartment. He ran his fingers along the edges, then lifted the top sheet and held it up to the light. His mustache twitched in satisfaction. You see, my friends, Jonathan Fanshawe did indeed leave behind his manuscript. But it was not merely a confession of Henry Lawson's crimes, it was something else entirely." He turned to Lady Margaret. "Tell me, madame, did your husband ever mention how his final novel was to end?" Lady Margaret blinked. "No. He was always so secretive about his endings. He said it was his greatest challenge, to find a resolution that no one could guess before the final page." Poirot smiled. "Precisely. And so, let us consider this. Jonathan Fanshawe, knowing he was in danger, chose to leave behind two legacies. The first was his confession, hidden in the manuscript. But the second?" Poirot tapped the pages meaningfully. "The second was the final chapter of his novel, one that was yet to be written." Alfred Groves let out an audible gasp. "You mean he never finished it?" "Exactement," Poirot confirmed. "The greatest mystery writer of his time left behind his own mystery, one that remains unsolved. You see, my friends, in all of this talk of crime and deception, we have forgotten the true essence of Jonathan Fanshawe's genius. He was a storyteller first and foremost, and even in death, he has left us with one final puzzle." A hush fell over the room. Hastings scratched his head. "Well, I say, Poirot, that's all very poetic. But what does it mean practically? Poirot's eyes gleamed. It means, mon ami, that somewhere within these pages, Jonathan Fanshawe has left us a final message. Something we have yet to discover. Lady Margaret straightened. You mean, there is something hidden in the manuscript? Poirot nodded. Indeed, and it is a mystery that I believe we must solve before we consider this case truly closed. Carefully, he laid out the pages upon the grand oak table. The crisp, typed words lined the pages in meticulous order, but Poirot was not looking at the words themselves. He was looking at the spaces between them, the rhythm of the text, the places where ink had been pressed harder, or where letters seemed out of place. Hastings, watching Poirot's scrutiny, sighed. I don't see anything strange about it, Poirot. Just words on a page. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a small magnifying glass from his pocket and passed it over the pages with great care. Then, suddenly, his expression shifted. Ah-ha! Hastings nearly jumped. What? What is it? Poirot straightened, his gaze filled with triumph. My friends, I have found it. The final clue Jonathan Fanshawe left behind. He pointed to a peculiar detail near the bottom of one page. Look closely here, mon ami. Do you see how the letters in certain words are slightly misaligned? The typewriter he used was of excellent quality, but here we see an inconsistency. The pressure of the keys is different. Lady Margaret leaned forward. I don't understand. What does it mean? Poirot carefully turned to another page, then another, until he had lined up several passages side by side. Jonathan Fanshawe was a man who understood the power of words, and in his final days he used them to leave a message hidden within his very own work. He ran a finger beneath certain letters, plucking them out one by one. Hastings' breath caught as he began to see the pattern. MurderisnotLawson. Murderer is not Lawson, Hastings whispered aloud. His face paled. But Poirot. We just proved that Lawson killed him. Poirot exhaled softly. Did we, mon ami? Or did we only assume that we had reached the truth? A cold silence settled over them. Lady Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. If it wasn't Lawson, then who? Poirot folded his hands, his expression grave. That, madame, is the final question, and one that I believe we shall answer very soon. Alfred Groves, who had been silent for the longest. Time took an uneasy step back. Surely you're not saying there's still another murderer among us? Poirot turned to him, his expression unreadable. Monsieur, what I am saying is that the true mystery is not yet over. The room, once filled with relief and closure, was now thick with unease once more. Poirot stepped back from the table, his voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we must prepare ourselves. The real murderer has yet to be unmasked, and I fear they are still among us. A chill ran through the group, and somewhere in the vast halls of Whitehaven Manor, a shadow stirred in the dim light, listening, watching, waiting. Chapter 10. The truth in the final lines. The air inside Whitehaven Manor was thick with tension, as though the very walls held their breath, waiting for Poirot's final revelation. The storm outside had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, punctuated only by the occasional crackling of the fireplace. The gathered individuals, Lady Margaret Fanshawe, Alfred Groves, Evelyn Harper, Captain Hastings, and Inspector Barnes, sat in strained anticipation, eyes fixed upon the small Belgian detective who stood at the center of the room, his hands neatly clasped in front of him. The truth was near. Hastings cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Well, Poirot, you've certainly done it this time. First, we believe Henry Lawson to be the murderer, and now you tell us that Jonathan Fanshawe's own manuscript says otherwise. I must say it's all rather, unsettling. Poirot, his moustache twitching, gave Hastings a patient look. Mon ami, is that not the nature of the truth? It unsettles, it challenges, it forces us to reconsider all that we once believed. And now, we stand upon the precipice of that very revelation. Lady Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. If it wasn't Henry Lawson, then who? Poirot, please. Tell us the truth. Poirot gave a slow nod, then began pacing, his polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the wooden floor. Let us first consider what we know. Jonathan Fanshawe was murdered in his study, struck from behind with a heavy object, the very bust of Shakespeare that he so admired. We found evidence that suggested Henry Lawson was in the room that evening. His fingerprints, his footprints. We believed with all certainty that he was the guilty party. And yet, Poirot paused dramatically. We now have the words of the victim himself, hidden within his final manuscript. Murderer is not Lawson. A collective shiver ran through the group. Evelyn Harper, who had maintained a quiet dignity throughout the proceedings, spoke for the first time. Then what does it mean? If Henry Lawson was framed, who was behind it? Poirot's sharp eyes fixed on her. Ah, Mademoiselle Harper, that is the question, is it not? And it is a question that requires careful consideration. Let us examine the inconsistencies, the small details that did not fit. He turned to Hastings. Do you recall, mon ami, what I said upon first arriving at Whitehaven Manor? I remarked upon the very nature of this crime, that it was theatrical, a performance, if you will. Hastings furrowed his brow. Yes, you did say something of the sort. But what does that have to do with it? Poirot lifted a single finger. Everything. You see, this murder was designed to tell a story. The killer knew that we would follow the evidence, that we would see Henry Lawson as the natural suspect. But they underestimated one thing. Poirot tapped his temple. The little gray cells. A hush fell over the room. Poirot turned his attention to Lady Margaret. Madame, may I trouble you to recall the events of the night of the murder once more? Lady Margaret, though pale, straightened in her chair. I was in my chambers, reading. The storm was raging, and I did not hear anything until much later, when I left to find Jonathan. That was when I discovered his body. Poirot nodded. And the door to the study? Was it locked? Lady Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. No, it was open. Poirot's expression did not change, but his eyes gleamed. And yet, when we first arrived at the scene, we found that the study door had been locked from the inside. Hastings frowned. Yes, I remember that. We had to break the door down. Poirot spread his hands. Voila! A most peculiar thing, is it not? A door that was open when the body was found, but locked when the investigation began. Alfred Groves stiffened. Are you suggesting someone locked it after the body was discovered? Poirot's smile was thin. No, monsieur. I am suggesting something far more sinister. The door was locked before the crime ever took place. A gasp rippled through the group. Evelyn leaned forward. But how is that possible? Poirot stepped toward the desk, placing his hands upon its polished surface. Because the crime was not committed when we first believed it to be. Jonathan Fanshawe was not murdered at the time we assumed. No, my friends. He was already dead long before we ever thought to look for him. The room fell into stunned silence. Inspector Barnes, who had remained quiet up until this moment, rubbed his chin. Poirot, are you saying the entire timeline is wrong? Poirot nodded. Precisely. Consider, mes amis, the one detail that always troubled me. The tea. Hastings blinked. Tea. Oui. The tea that Jonathan Fanshawe had supposedly been drinking at the time of his death. When I examined the cup, I found that it had been untouched, and yet by all accounts he was working late that evening, as was his custom. Would he not have sipped his tea, even once? Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami, because by the time that tea was placed upon his desk, he was already dead. Lady Margaret let out a soft cry. Hastings' jaw dropped. Good Lord, Poirot! But if that's the case, when was he actually murdered? Poirot turned slowly, his gaze landing on each person in the room before settling on one. Monsieur Groves, perhaps you would care to answer that? A heavy silence followed. Alfred Groves stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Poirot stepped forward. Do you not, monsieur? You, the man who stood to gain the most from Jonathan Fanshaw's final manuscript? You, the only one who knew the true nature of his work? Groves swallowed hard, but Poirot did not relent. You arrived at Whitehaven Manor under the pretense of discussing business, and yet you did not leave when you said you would. You lingered. You ensured that Jonathan Fanshawe was alone in his study, and then— Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. You killed him! Lady Margaret let out a soft gasp. Groves took a step back. This is absurd. Why would I do such a thing? Poirot's expression hardened. Because, monsieur, Jonathan Fanshawe had decided to part ways with you. He no longer wished for you to publish his final work. He had made arrangements to take his manuscript elsewhere, had he not? Groves paled. Poirot's voice was like a blade. You knew that if he took his work elsewhere, you would lose everything. And so, you ensured that he would never do so. You murdered him, then staged the scene, locking the door, planting evidence to implicate Henry Lawson. You even tampered with the time of death by ensuring the tea was left untouched, misleading us all into thinking the crime had occurred much later. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Groves's face contorted. You have no proof. Poirot's voice was deadly calm. On the contrary, monsieur. The final manuscript you so desperately tried to conceal holds all the proof I need. Groves's breathing became shallow. His hands trembled. Then, in a flash, he turned, bolting toward the door. But Inspector Barnes was faster. With a swift movement, he blocked the exit, handcuffs at the ready. Not so fast, Groves. Groves sagged in defeat. Poirot adjusted his cuffs with meticulous care. And so, mes amis, the mystery is concluded. Jonathan Fanshawe may have left his final story unfinished, but justice, it seems, has found its own perfect ending. A heavy silence followed. Then Hastings let out a breath. Well, I must say, Poirot, you've done it again. Poirot gave a small, satisfied smile. Mais oui, mon ami. The truth as always will out.